What is the weather going to be like in 2025? And might knowing whether a particular month is going to be above or below average in rainfall or temperature affect the way that we plan our gardens? What garden trends are we going to be seeing in 2025 and beyond, both in larger food production that we all still depend on and our home gardens? Here to chat about these fascinating topics is the editor of the Old Farmer's Almanac, Connare. And don't let the word old mislead you. The Old Farmer's Almanac is staying on top of all things climate, technology, and science as it pertains to the food that we grow and eat. She is a vegetable gardener herself, and you can hear her passion for all things growing. I loved this conversation with her, and I know you will too. And one more thing, if you want to have a little fun while listening to today's episode, at one point we both say a word incorrectly, and that word's actual meaning is totally different than what we are intending. For you wordsmiths, I'll share that with you at the end of the conversation and see if you discover it and get it right. I'll also come back and give you some insights on my region's forecast and how that might impact my plant decisions for 2025. But for now, let's get to my conversation with Connare, editor of the Old Farmer's Almanac. This episode is brought to you by the Homestead movie coming to theaters on December 20th. This movie is a fictional account of an ex-Green Beret and his family who escaped to an eccentric prepper's fortress after a nuclear bomb is detonated in Los Angeles. It shows how families survive by living off the land amidst chaos around them. My family got to pre-screen this movie, and I especially appreciated and enjoyed its emphasis on living on the land and building community. When you pre-order your tickets using the link in the show notes, you could win your own homestead worth $300,000, including a tiny home, a greenhouse, and a 6-month emergency supply of food storage, among countless other items in the giveaway. To watch the movie's trailer and pre-order the tickets and enter the giveaway, just head to the link in the show notes. Carol, I love that you are a gardener and you were telling me that you are a vegetable gardener and that you love growing vegetables. And one thing that I saw in the newest edition of the Old Farmer's Almanac was that some of the trends that are coming up are that we're starting to see that there are cultivars or varieties that are developed that are more heat tolerant and water thrifty. But what I saw on examples of that in the almanac was that they were more ornamentals. Can you speak to, as a vegetable gardening lover yourself, is the same type of innovation happening in the realm of edible gardening?
Well, first of all, yes, I think we are seeing that across the growing landscape. But more so I think more so development, a lot of hybridization. And also we've kind of had an advantage in the vegetable world in terms of heirloom varieties. Those are the varieties that really tend to be water thrifty, and tolerant of different weather conditions. So, it's idea of building on some of those old seeds and, seed banks. That idea is actually something more we see in terms of making plants more resilient. And then also, I would say techniques are some of the trends we're seeing. Things like starting garden later, even if you have a warmer area. If you wait a little bit, you're going to reduce blight or mold or things like that kind of, attack our vegetables. So it's kind of this combination of what's out there. But yeah, I think you're going to start to see a lot more development in this area. We're seeing it definitely with fruit trees and shrubs.
We're going to be talking all about weather, because we kind of already touched on that a little bit in climate, and then also garden trends, because in some cases, those things are starting to go hand in hand, which I think is a really good thing. But before we get to garden trends in particular, I would love for you to introduce yourself a little bit more fully. Tell us how long you've been doing this. You are the editor of the Old Farmer's Almanac that a lot of people are familiar with. I happened to be to stop by at a gas station on a road trip recently, and they had it, right in there. So a lot of people may recognize this, but they may not realize that all is involved. And there's so many amazing articles, and you guys spend a lot of time on garden trends. But what do you love most about this 200-plus-year-old publication?
Thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure to talk about the Almanac, which is an annual publication around since 1792. So I'm the 14th editor in 233 years. I'm the second female to hold the job. And, it's really a long legacy of incredible editorship, I think. And first of all, when we started out, you might have the Bible in your house and the Almanac. And if you were in maybe, a more urban area, you might have a newspaper or a broadside. So there wasn't a lot of material in the home that, this was really meant to be just like the Bible, sort of a day-to-day book, but really for growing it. In 1792, every other person was a farmer. People really tended their own food. And so it was a big deal. And that's why back then, people didn't have the internet or even many access to books, but they could see the night sky and they did have traditions passed down from others. So these ideas where every single day is a farming day and it's important and you want to get whatever edge you can because you're feeding yourself and your family. So that attention to the seasons, I think, is something that really is, in the Almanac is really a calendar. So what do I love the most about my job really is, I think, why we've lasted. It's that we do have, right, and I have on a chalkboard in my room, our tagline, with a pleasant degree of humor. Like, we are here to inform, but also entertain, right? It doesn't have to be all work and no play. We always have poems, really, or prose, in the farmer's calendar. We have reader recipes. So the favorite thing is that we hear from readers every day, phone calls, emails, over the almanac.com site, and we talk to them. So my favorite part is that keeps us humble. It's like, we're not going to get out of line. Like, we're not going to go off the deep end. Like, because people really want, and that's really what the Almanac is about, is like, you can pick it up and it might be, we're just looking at data. People go to us in March. They buy it in the fall. That's when we sell our annual edition. People love the weather forecast, those long range weather forecasts. But it's really our biggest. They return to us in March and we get it like we're growers.
Oh, I imagine with the physical publication, you do have that one foot into your roots and into the roots of growing our own food, which I think, has kind of been lost to some degree. But then you also have one foot in right now to have to stay relevant to today's grower. And so I love that this publication has both, and you've been able to honestly walk that difficult line so well. And I think in one area is the section on garden trends, which you said humor. I was reading a couple of these. I was sitting beside my husband and I just had to, elbow him and read it. I had to chuckle because some of them were funny. We'll let others, read all of those because they're not all garden related. But when I was looking at some of the garden trends, I guess what I would love to start with is that, yes, we can, as home gardeners, think, okay, what's going on that will affect my garden in particular? But if we are realistic, most of us are not growing everything we eat or raising everything we eat. We still are relying on large farms. As much as we like to condemn, so to speak, big ag, and for good reason to some degree, we do depend on farmers and we do depend on farms, but even they are having to make adaptations with climate and things that are coming up. So I would love for you to speak to what changes are happening in that landscape, because we've got weather extremes and we've got farmers aging out without a new generation to replace them. I know I'd see that concern. So with all of that in mind, all of those challenges, what are some trends on the horizon that hopefully will give us some hope in this area?
Oh, there's a lot to be hopeful about, really, truly. There's a lot of exciting things happening. And just what you're saying, and just to back up, it's like, yeah, okay, so if you're a farmer and you have, a commercial crop, you might get the Almanac, but you're getting your ag news, you're getting your specific thing. And so, but what we share is that exactly what you said, those of us who are working on bringing our best food into our own homes by our own hands are also interested in what's happening around us, in terms of, we may not apply bee vectoring in our own garden or AI, but those things are happening. And so I'd say in terms of the generational, it's really interconnected, these issues. There's more AI coming to farming. The idea that you could have a robotic picker that would damage a lot less fruit. Or,
Mm.
you could deliver, we've been like, we're organic and sustainable, since 1792, but we know those bigger growers need to use integrated pest management. Well, if they can bring a lot less of an agent in because it can be delivered really specifically, that's a good news item. So I think those are things that the trends that are exciting. But in terms of generational challenge, you're spot on. People's land may be worth more than it ever was, except not as a farm. So what
Mm.
can we do, and why would people want to come back to the farm? So it's pretty exciting what's happening. And I think that it's connected to the weather too, diversity. So farms that are successful are really, especially in that medium to small, monoculture is not what we're going to be seeing. That's not what's successful anymore. You could get wiped out by weather. So what does diversity look like? It might look like lots of different crops. We see so much experimentation in the grain realm. That's so cool. Those, I see some really resilient and incredible grains being developed. And that's again, weather driven. But so for someone who maybe, their parents or grandparents, they can really go and learn the latest technologies and bring those back, which could make farming for them really exciting. But I think the diversity piece too, it's like we see farms making products. They may have a commercial crop, but then they'll deliver products directly to the consumer, some other niche product. They might do an Airbnb and have people have a farm experience in the months they're not farming. Will they be in a co-op and be able to deliver, in a bigger contract in combination with others? Like, this diversity is really about business. And so I think that is another exciting piece that's bringing the younger generation back. So those are trends, kind of bigger ones that we see and that we've been thinking about and writing about.
I would love to dive a little deeper on something you said initially about how farmers are using AI more. And you could probably give me more examples, but I remember reading somewhere, and it may have been in the Almanac, but I can't remember if it was or not, about one of the things that I don't know if this is actually happening yet or if they're testing it, but these machines being able to identify what's the weed and what's the plant and specifically targeting whatever pesticide they're using for the weed. So, and I think you alluded to that where there's not as much of the chemical load. Is that happening mainly on conventional scale, or is that also being used for organic, like you said, integrated pest management where organic practices are acceptable? Like, what's that actually looking like?
Well, I think in terms of it's, well, for you, I don't know about you, but when I see something, I kind of whip out my phone in my garden and I find out what is that thing. So
Hmm.
that's AI. That's us using AI in our garden. If I'm on a walk and I use Seek as an app, it's a free app, or even just a photo, you can get information on the plant. So I don't know. So to me, that's AI in the garden. And on the bigger scale, yes, it's exciting. Like, because they could use that same technology going down a long row, you could imagine with a robot and only treating or only picking the weed. So there's lots of reasons to get rid of certain plants. And yeah, that's definitely happening. But I think it's in our own gardens too. I haven't heard of any uses of robotics in a home garden, but I feel like I use AI when I'm looking up plants and qualities and things about them.
Yeah. I just have to think I've got a son as a senior in high school and my daughter is in eighth grade. And just looking at the future career opportunities, I'm just thinking that might be an exciting way for our kids to get involved in helping produce food that's a little different than the farmers, what they think of as a farmer, especially if they have any kind of skills in robotics or engineering or things like that. So
Right.
that's kind of hopeful.
It is. Agreed.
What's that? This was something that I saw in the Almanac that fascinated me. I'd never heard of it before, but you mentioned it, and it's called bee vectoring. So, what is that? Is it organic? Is it something like, is this something we just look at from afar as home gardeners, or would it ever be something that we would have access to?
Well, I think it's a very basic principle. Bees are pollinating, and as well as other pollinators pollinate. And so bee vectoring, and we know, especially when there was the hive collapse that, we've all were aware of, and been a big comeback. So beekeepers will travel with their hives to crops that need pollinating. And so one step further is adding and using some kind of an agent and getting them to deliver. So if I want to get botrytis, I don't want my commercial flower field to get that, and I'm getting the pollinators in anyway. Can we, treat the flowers? And so it's very much at its infancy. In terms of organic, I think it really depends. I think it's just a delivery system. So it probably could be. I mean, it's obviously they wouldn't want to harm the bees. These are beekeepers who are making a living off of them. But yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's such an interesting idea, right? Because some of us have to hand pollinate things. And when you talk about trends, and I think you'd see this in the gardening trend section, pollinators and attention to pollinators has really hit the home gardener. People are really wanting to be part of making sure that there's enough pollinators around their garden.
And honestly, I think that could be attributed to so many people raising the alarm, and also gardeners seeing what happens when their squash vegetable isn't growing, or
Right.
where are the cucumber fruits. And we can say, well, have you seen a bee or any? And they're like, no. And I think home gardeners are realizing, hey, what everybody else is shouting about is actually real because I'm seeing it. And so
Right.
I love that the attention is being paid so that more people can contribute to that. But going back to the definition of bee vectoring, to my understanding, it's where if the bee would carry, like you said, something that would be either is it a pesticide or even something that would prevent disease. I mean, I
Yes.
guess
I
it would
mean,
have to be pretty targeted.
right. And I mean, that's, in terms of a pesticide, like I said, I don't know as much about that. We don't really advocate that, but I could see where there would be a positive, say, bacteria,
Mhm.
that's a natural fighter of something or something positive. Again, if we're moving from monoculture to diversity of crops, like sometimes maybe we need some help with that. Like I could see that. It's pretty cool, they're out there doing their business anyway. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think it probably, from what I read, was like it's in its infancy, but it would seem like it's open to a lot of possibility and natural ones as well as perhaps things that are pesticides.
Yeah. I guess in my thought, I'm thinking, I don't deal with this, and you probably don't either in New Hampshire, but a lot of my listeners deal with the pickle worm. And from what I've seen about the
Oh,
pickle worm, it's really hard to prevent because you have to occlude the moth from laying its eggs in the flower. But in order to do that, you've got to prevent anything from, like, even bees. So if the bees could carry maybe BT or something, I'm just thinking
right,
outside the box.
right.
I'm like, that would be a way that could help that. To think of those possibilities might be on the horizon. Now, what I want to move to another trend that caught my eye, just because this is something that I know a lot of listeners are interested in, and that is the trends on certain herbs and what herbs are trendy right now. And you would think what herbs people are interested in are mostly kitchen herbs, but the ones that were listed in the almanac were calendula, chamomile, holy basil, lemon balm, yarrow, and the theme that I'd see here is either these are medicinal herbs or they're used for teas. Can you speculate on why these particular herbs have kind of gotten popular recently?
Absolutely. Medicinally, and as you say, with tonics and teas. Also, just what we were saying, these particular herbs in the garden are also pollinator friendly. So they've got multiple uses. They're beautiful
Yeah.
color flowerings, and they bloom at different times of the year so that you're giving the pollinators, their food over a longer period of time. But we're seeing a very, I think certainly the epidemic, that we all went through has made people more aware about home healing. And we're
Mhm.
seeing, home remedies has been in the almanac for 233 years. We actually wrote about tea in this particular 2025 edition. And again, tea, is that really a home remedy? Well, all the newest studies just show how beneficial it is and how different teas operate on us. So we see tons of questions about it on our website, a lot of interest in, like you said, the culinary herbs people got down. They love that, right? They're going to do
Mhm.
that. They're going to have maybe pots in their winter windowsills. But it's the other herbs that I think are really attracting people, making salves and ointments and tonics and tinctures. And there's so much more. It's easier today. The information's right out there. The tools are right there. It's pretty simple. So, and another exciting way to be a beginner in your own garden is just, play with these well-being herbs.
And I wonder too, now that you say that, if those of us who've been gardening for a little while, we learned how to grow the basic culinary herbs that we know we were going to use in our kitchen. And then we realized that herbs are pretty, like, they're not fussy. They're pretty easy to grow. And so maybe a lot of this interest is that, oh yeah, now that I could basil and oregano, let's try venturing out to some more. And like you said, so many of them are beautiful and they smell good and they promote well-being in so many different ways. I love that. Are there any other trends that you think the home gardener would be interested in knowing about?
I think a big one that we see is really kind of this reattention, and it's nothing new, to soil,
Mm.
and the growing medium, and understanding that it really is an ecosystem. And so we've always been, a source for how to compost. There's always new things. I think we know that peat is being outlawed it's outlawed in the UK. We do source ours from Canada here in the US, but it's also the biggest carbon sink, on the earth. So it's like peat will probably diminish in its availability. And the next best thing is your own, compost. So seeing a lot of attention to that. We're seeing a lot of people really try indoor gardening. We know houseplants, you can't get enough of them, but we have in our hallway here at work, a light table where we grow lettuce, all winter. It's just something nice to have something fresh. We can do beans and herbs. I'm going to try some ginger this year. But I think, that we see that as a trend. It's affordable. You can go to the dollar store and get a grow light instead of a little table. So lots more of that going on. So those are some of the things that we see.
Oh, I love that. Moving on to the weather. I think everybody's interested in the weather. I was just thinking the other day when I was watching the weather every day. I don't know how it is in New Hampshire. I know those who are living like sunny California, they don't have this relationship with their meteorologists, but we're pretty close with our meteorologists here in Arkansas because you never know what the weather's going to be every day. And then we have tornado warnings like all the time, not all the time, but a lot. And so like you kind of have that parasocial relationship with your meteorologist because you depend so much on what he has learned. So weather affects us all is what I'm trying to say. But the one thing that the Old Farmer's Almanac is known for, among many, but one thing is, like you said before, the weather forecast. And we're talking about, I'm looking at the Almanac right here, and it's telling me what to expect next August. And we're recording here in the fall. So I want to ask you now, I know there's trade secrets here. I understand you can't spill all the beans with me. Can you tell me how are the long-term weather forecasts in your almanac different from what we receive in the short term from the meteorologist?
Sure. Yeah. And as you said, weather, it's like it's the glue. It's the great unknown for everybody still. And for those of us who are even just sky, we have a lot of sky watching tips and night sky things in our book as well. That's weather dependent as well, growing outdoors people. So yeah, it's crazy, right? I mean, our meteorologists can barely get it right half the time. And here we go forecasting long range weather. So it's been in the almanac since forever. And it is proprietary. It's just the same formula that we used way back when. But nowadays, of course, we have tons of data and we can crunch it really fast. But the biggest difference is that we look at sunspot science. So the sun is having its magnetic storms all the time. Many people are seeing auroras a lot further south than ever before. That's because it's been an incredibly active, and we just hit peak of cycle 25. So we're about to hit cycle 26. These are 11 or so year cycles of magnetic storms, and they have a distinct pattern. It is a up and down, right? So our founder, Robert B. Thomas, was an astronomer. Like all farmers, not much else to do, watching the night sky. But he was really interested in this. And so his long range formula, which is what we use today, takes that data and that really makes that almost primary, but laying it over time. What are the patterns we're seeing? And now we have our own team at AccuWeather who works with our formula, and they can factor in things like ocean temperatures. What is the waviness of the jet stream? And so there's just a lot more data. But long range forecasting, as we do it, is about that layering on that pattern, which is, 25 cycles of 11 years. It's a ton of, you can really look at that over time, 11 cycles. So that's it. It's kind of crazy. And I say, we always say 80%. It depends where you are. You might be in a zip code where we got 100%, but you might be in one where we got 30%.
Really?
Overall, many areas are seeing these like extreme rainfalls in short amount of time. That's very hard to predict. So I'd say we
Sure.
do really well on temperature and are getting better on precipitation. But over the last few years, that's been tricky.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine. Okay, so you don't have to answer this question if you don't want to, but I was just thinking about all those layers you were mentioning. How many scientists do you have working for you? Like it's got to be it's got to be a lot to go into it.
We have a team of two. They're amazing. So
Oh
they're
wow.
meteorologists, and they already are well versed in climatology, really, and meteorology, and they bring to it our formula, which is about the sun cycle. So they're incredible, and also to do the detailed forecast is just it's a ton of work.
Yeah.
And we work with them to translate that into every single region and also readable, so that we know people pick this up in the fall for the weather forecast. It's just so cool to say, like, Jenny's getting married in California in June. Like, what will it be? We get a lot of that. But the overall is really what's of most interest to us growers. Like, we are calling for a very mild winter for most of the US. Again,
Yeah.
we had the hottest summer on record. We won't be surprised if, as we hit this cycle peak, that it's same for this coming summer. We're also seeing trends in terms of much more water in the atmosphere generally. So, like in New England, for instance, in the Northeast, we're just getting a lot more rainfall, whereas some of the drier areas are getting a lot more dry. So it's kind of like, what you got, you're getting more of. And so we're
Wow.
seeing that. So that's kind of from the growing perspective, like what can I plan for?
Yeah, I happen to see, and I think the meteorologists are starting to publish this, and this seems to track what you're saying, is that I am seeing the bigger swath of the country is predicted to have a milder winter than usual. Are there any other predictions that stand out for 2025, either across the board for all of us in the US or just maybe by region? Anything that you're seeing in particular that you think is notable?
Well, what we're seeing is it looks like it's just a weak La Nina. And so what that
Okay.
that means is that the jet stream is pretty wavy. It's slow. It's slowed. And so that still leaves an opportunity for super cold blasts to go pretty deep. And that's a problem for growers, right? Like especially those
Right.
spring ones where, the blossoms are on the trees and it's April and, a cold Arctic blast comes and they're gone. I mean, people are seeing that stuff. That's the reason to diversify. That's the reason to try, other crops, other things. But that's kind of something that we see, and that's really like middle of the country, right? It's kind of
Sure, sure.
that's where that Arctic blast is going to come down for the jet stream. So that's a trend that isn't a happy note for a lot of people, but it's a
Mhm.
reality that we've seen patterns.
Yeah, as one who is in the middle of the country, I think about, like you said, last year is going to be another mild winter. And my first thought was, wait a minute, we got down to -1 and I'm in zone 8A, but that was like for 2 days. The rest of the winter was pretty mild. But it's that one anomaly that messes it all
Yes.
up because everything
Yeah.
else was going perfectly fine in the winter, except we had that period. And then you mentioned also just those late freezes. That's something that we have seen here in Arkansas. It wasn't this year, but it might have been the year before, beautiful spring and then late freeze. And we had a peach orchard lose everything. And then one year, I think we had a blueberry. I didn't lose all of my blueberries, but I lost a bigger portion than I usually do. My blueberries are over 10 years old. When I first saw that, I was thinking, okay, well, this is just a year. That stinks. Hopefully it'll get better next year. But it makes me fearful that this is becoming more of a norm than an aberration. And I guess what you're saying too is that we've got to learn how to maybe adapt some things. And I guess at the top of my mind, I'm thinking, well, yeah, plant your early ripening varieties of fruit, but also get some that are later. That way, if you get a early freeze, then at least you're not going to lose your entire crop. Are are there any other proactive measures that you're seeing, like big picture, that people are starting to take to try to lessen the impact of these really like unseasonable cold snaps?
Well, I saw that you wrote a whole guide on greenhouses. I think we're seeing a real uptick in terms of trying to control the environment more, high tunnels, greenhouses, people experimenting with just, I have friends here who just, they'll put a low tunnel and they'll just grow sweet potatoes or, kale into whatever, just put that little bit of protection in the place in their yard. So yeah, I feel like people are really getting more creative. I think that the spacing out and timing of things is very important because you're right. It's really been identified more as a pattern than an aberration now. Like that is happening. So, but there's old techniques too, right? If like you said, 2 days or something, or we know that's coming, down. When I lived in Massachusetts, the farmers in the orchards would sometimes light fires, in the orchard, if they were thinking there was a killing frost in the spring. So there are old ideas. I mean, this is not, these climate changes aren't the first time, that they've happened in these sort of trends. So it's about resilience and really finding ways to make sure that you're not going to get wiped out.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad that there are those options. I'm sad that we have to think about that because in some way it takes the joy out of it to have to be like, okay, I've got to be ready to like whack-a-mole, like what climate thing's coming this time, But I'm glad that there are some things that we can start doing because we got to be resilient, and we're also intelligent beings that can come up with things to be able to adapt. Hey, just jumping in here. If you are brand new to the thought of planting by an almanac or by the moon or by the stars, then you may be interested in an interview that I did in May of 2023. It's episode number 309 with Sarah L. Hall. She's the author of this book called Sewed in the Stars. This was a fascinating book. She's actually a professor in Kentucky, or was at the time of writing this, and she went and interviewed all sorts of people who have been using almanacs to plant their gardens for their entire lifetime. I found this to be a really interesting book, and it was a really fascinating conversation. And if you're interested in this at all, I highly recommend you go back and listen to that conversation with her just to give you a little bit of insight. We'll have the link directly to that podcast episode in the show notes. Let's go back to weather. How do gardeners that do follow the Old Gardener's Almanac faithfully, how do you see them adjusting their decisions based on the predictions that they see in the almanac in regard to temperature and rainfall expectations?
So severalfold. About half the country, I think, moved up a half zone with the new hardiness zones. So that means maybe there's an earlier planting available. But what we're seeing is that people are having more problems with pests and diseases because they're planting earlier. So just because you can doesn't mean you should or need to, or maybe like we were just saying, maybe you're going to plant a few things and see how that goes, but you might wait to that traditional later in May or what have you, depending on your zone. So I think that's something that we're seeing in terms of reactions to weather, right? It's like, okay, this might be blooming earlier here, but the birds that need that aren't here yet. And those birds are the ones that eat the squash beetle larvae. So it's like there's this kind of misalignment of things. But I think we rely on nature to also realign, right? She's resilient too. We have to be different too. I think sharing locally and regionally is super important. We drive people to their cooperative extensions in their area. They're going to know the plants. Like you might all of a sudden be able to grow a nut tree you were able to grow, or what variety have they been testing. That's really the foundational knowledge in terms of where you're growing.
Yeah, as I've been diving into the research that's been done in Arkansas in particular, they're on top of it as far as testing, where do these things grow best and what doesn't work. And you get that information at a very local level that you're probably not hearing if you're hearing a podcast like mine that tries to appeal to most people. So I could definitely see that, zeroing into your local resources can be a really helpful thing for sure.
So like on our website, almanac.com is really fun if you haven't checked it out, or I think beginners would love it. you go to the weather, you can type in your zip code and you can get a 60-day forecast. You can get a picture of the long range, but you can also go to the gardening side and hit your zip code and it will give you planting dates for your exact zip code. And those are based on, 1,500 weather stations across the US, and Canada. So it's really good. We're relying on, for our information and really the experts, but it's all gathered and kind of curated for you. But I think that's the idea is gardening is local now. That's the most important knowledge. Seed libraries, many public libraries or university libraries are starting these seed libraries. You can learn how to save seed. You can share seed, know origins, understand, again, finding those heirlooms, finding stuff that is locally successful that's the gold standard right there.
What else, for those who are unfamiliar with your publication, what can they expect to find when they go to their local gas station, Lowe's? Where else can they find this? I'm sure they could probably order it online too, but what else can they expect to find in this that they may enjoy or find helpful?
Yes, we're everywhere right now. We try to be everywhere. We're a great gift item too. So you'll see us, wherever you buy plant stuff, bookstores, almanac.com, Amazon. So it's really fun. I think people really come to us for those gardening tips and calendars and planting dates. People love the best days chart, which is like, what's a good day to get a haircut? What's a good day to mow the lawn for, to encourage not to grow? So all those things are really fun. In fact, one of our editors is doing a story. He spent all year doing best days stuff on best days or not on best days, and he's going to report. So that's really fun. But this year's features, I think, are great. We talk about all kinds of cat curiosities. We talk about the Canadian origins of baseball, how to trick your climate. Like if you want a fig in New Hampshire, how can you do that? If you want something lilac-like in the South, how could that be? So that's a really fun story. Gardening by the Moon. Gardening by the Moon is a feature. We have moon gardening information in every edition for 233 years, but this is like back to the basics. What does it mean to garden by the moon? So that's in there. Yeah, it's a real mix. Folklore on tides. It's a good story too.
Yeah, I read many of those stories. I will say that one part that I would love that you could expand on this in the future. So if you're looking for ideas for next year, I love that the page that talked about if you see this happening in nature, then it's time to plant this. What's that called?
Phrenology.
Phrenology.
Yeah.
I find that so fascinating. And so you have a whole page on that, and it makes me I'm a vegetable gardener, so I'm not really sure what all those flowers are that I'm supposed to be looking at blooming, but I'm going to go look them up and see and just but because that's the way, between that and the moon and the stars, that's the way people did it before the internet, right? And so there's got to be some wisdom in there. So I just find that really fascinating.
It's so fun. Yes, phenology is great. It's like, what are the seasons? Then they're micro seasons, right? It's the forsythia season, or it's the chive season, or, my rhubarb has come up. Is it time to put in my peas or my lettuce? Yeah, it's so true, right? Because it might be a late spring. But those plants are the canaries in the gold mine, the harbingers. It's like, now it's time. Now it's ready because nature is doing it. So now I can do my gardening.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Carol, for coming on the podcast. I loved this conversation and I really enjoyed it. And I look forward to diving more into the Almanac myself as I start to plan my 2025 gardens. Anything else you want to leave with listeners today?
Oh, no, it's great to be on this podcast. It's a lot of fun. It was great to get to know your website. You have amazing resources. So any gardener out there, it's time to jump in.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Wasn't that a fun conversation? I learned so much, even after having gone through the Old Farmer's Almanac myself in preparation for talking with Carol. Now, the word that we both mispronounced is the word phenology. And the definition of phenology is this. It's the study of cyclic and seasonal natural phenomena, especially in relation to climate and plant and animal life. An example of this is to plant peas when the forsythias bloom. But we didn't say phenology in the beginning. We both accidentally said phrenology. What does this mean? Well, we'll have to move from botany to biology for that one. The definition of phrenology is the detailed study of the shape and size of the cranium as a supposed indication of character and mental abilities. If you got that right, kudos for you, because that was something that I didn't know for sure. Carol did know it. She caught herself later, but I had no idea. Now, the last thing I thought would be interesting to share with you is what my forecast in Region 8, the Deep South, is for 2025, particularly when it comes to my biggest planting months in February and March with temperature and rainfall. In February, after 2 months of above average temperatures, we're expecting to get a pretty low, significant dip in temperatures. What that might mean is that I might not be able to get an early planting of broccoli and cabbage out into the garden in the later part of February. That has actually worked out really well when I've been able to do that in the past. But if February is really low, I may have to wait a little bit longer. And it also may mean that soil temperature may be too low to plant potatoes during that period, which is usually when I like to plant potatoes to get them in the ground as soon as possible if the soil is warm. But if the soil isn't warm, then I would have to delay a little bit. But then in March, even though we are predicted to go back up in temperature, actually a little bit above normal, the amount of rainfall predicted in March in my region tops the charts. What might that mean? That would mean that I would have to even further delay planting potatoes, because if you plant potatoes when the soil is too saturated, sometimes they will rot in the soil before they sprout. So I certainly hope the Almanac is wrong about that. Knowing these things, will I change my plant timing or any of my plans? Well, I probably won't, but I will keep those predictions in the back of my mind, especially when it comes to making decisions at planting time. We'll just see how that all bears out. What about you? Have you ever used the prediction from the Old Farmer's Almanac to plan your garden? I would love to hear. And if you are listening on Spotify or on YouTube, you can post a comment and let me know what your experience has been. And even if you don't use these predictions or even watch them loosely, the Old Farmer's Almanac has an abundance of interesting garden articles that you will enjoy during these long nights of the cold time that we have in our homes as we are waiting for spring. We will put the link to order online in the description of this episode, or you can grab a copy at your local garden center or your local bookstore. I sure hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did with Carol. I am so appreciative that Carol took her time to come on the podcast today. If you get a chance, tell her thank you, and I will chat with you again next week on the next episode of the podcast. Have a great day. This episode was brought to you by the movie Homestead. Watch how a prepper's family wrestles with real challenges around food security, safety, and community when life as they know it changes in an instant. It's an adventure film that's both captivating and challenging. Check out the trailer for yourself, and when you pre-order tickets at the link in the description, you could win your own equipped homestead worth $300,000. And the earlier you pre-order tickets, the more entries you get. The movie hits theaters on December 20th, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did.